Today, I want us to explore the beautiful chaos that is the Court of Fontaine, and talk about why, as confusing and chaotic as some of its design is, this actually kind of makes sense. You've got pipes that don't seem to serve any purpose, a maze-like layout that looks like it never stops stretching upward, a city of grandiose proportions, its curtains hiding the problems that fester below the surface. So, let's dive right on in. Is there more to life than just making Fontaine puns? Will I ever escape this prison of my own design? Now, in order to have a better understanding of why the Court of Fontaine is the way it is, we should first take a look at its inspirations and history. As is the case for every region and its respective city, there isn't a singular inspiration. They all take from multiple sources, which I think really helps them stand out from one another and adds to that layer of environmental storytelling that Hoyoverse are pretty good at all around. The Court of Fontaine combines elements of different cultural movements and architecture. There's layers to it in both a historical sense and a physical one, since the city is just very layered. The city's architectural evolution mostly lines up with our real world history, and it all started more or less back in the early 1700s with Baroque. No, not Baroque. I'm so sorry. This architectural style was basically Renaissance architecture, but grander, more opulent. This movement was associated with the consolidation of both the church and absolute monarchy, but having completed the Archon quest, Fontaine is heading away from this era now. What with the Archon stepping down, the throne no longer existing. What Baroque does give us though is most of the foundation for Fontaine City to grow on. This is followed by neoclassicism, which is widely believed to be a result of the Age of Enlightenment. This is where everything starts coming together. So, the Age of Enlightenment was a movement that basically laid the groundwork for modern day, emphasizing values such as individual freedom, liberty, rationalism, and, dare I say it, justice. So now that the Age of Enlightenment has come around, neoclassicism pops its head out and is like, hey, we should team up and teach that Baroque guy that it's not all about power and excess. And now we have a new cultural movement. Neoclassicism was the revival of classical architecture, which is Roman and Greek influence. This style was all about structure, logic, and symmetry, a polar opposite to Baroque, characterized by blank walls, columns, and often raised above ground. How does this relate to Fontaine's architecture, I hear you ask? Oh, you weren't asking? Well, Fontaine follows real-world history fairly closely. Not only can you see the mixture and evolution of the architecture, but you can also see its origins. Welcome to ancient Rome. Look at Remuria for a moment with me. According to official Genshin sources, inhabited by one of the earliest people. I mean, just look at this guy. He's so committed to classical mythology, he's turned himself into stone. This building certainly evokes ancient Rome, minus the magic and music. Now, let me take you over to the Palais. We love to see it. The world building ascends literally to new heights here. You can see the neoclassical style in the walls, colours and columns. But the key difference is it's not simply Roman influence, but Remurian. There's a small musical influence, a key part of Remurian architecture. Even the overall shape of the structure is very similar to the buildings we come across down under. Given all of that information, this building, while not new, probably isn't that old, which also would make sense considering there's probably quite a small time frame from when the Palais was built and when Fontaine underwent industrialization. Whoa, wait a hot minute, who is that? Hi, I'm the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution completely changed people's way of living. From machines to steam power, this led to a population boom. Sound familiar? Well, hop along a bit further in our history and Fontaine's, and we arrive at the second Industrial Revolution, which I believe is where Fontaine currently stands. An incredible amount of houses, apartments, and other buildings were built in this period. Since the Industrial Revolution had increased the growth of the cities due to population growth, but also a significant rise in the migration of people from the countryside to the city. In Fontaine's case, there's likely more reasons for this, as I did cover in a different video. Fontaine has been battling rising water for centuries at this point, so they also have to contend with migration from people who have lost their houses or can't afford to live in the countryside anymore. Now we get to where most of the city's designs come from. They draw heavily from this guy. Get a load of him. Yeah, this is Houseman. There was an increasing population and too much traffic. Houseman's urban plan was about opening up the city and connecting it up. We see this in the wide streets and pretty much all the apartment buildings in the Court of Fontaine, simpler and more unified, with the recognizable cream colouring and mansard roofing. There's even a distinction shown between the upper class and the lower class of Fontaine. First class apartments were comprised of of courtyards, gardens, and so on. We can't really see if these places have gardens, but the biggest difference is that they don't have shops on the ground floor. This is for second-class buildings. During this period, there were also different styles such as Art Deco, characterized by its clean lines and sleek rectangles. We see this in the doors of the Palais, the station, and other areas of the city, which takes us up to the 1910s. This is where Fontaine is most likely at. So given what we've established here, that would mean a large portion of the buildings within the city are relatively new, though I mean, a lot of it probably has to be since they're constantly rebuilding and adding new layers. Everything always comes back to that damn onion. Fontaine's largest design feature is its sheer verticality. While Sumeri City may just beat it in terms of height, the court of Fontaine makes the most out of its layers. It's like a stack of pancakes. And the grandiosity of it is, for all intents and purposes, an attempt to make the city seem larger than it actually is. You'll see me coming back to this talking point a lot throughout the video. The spectacle of the court. That's what Fontaine is all about after all. It's all about creating an impression. Which, yes, okay, technically every city in Genshin is, but Fontaine's design in particular leans heavily into this considering the themes of the region. In almost every aspect of the city, impression is more important than functionality. But for now, let's get into the general layout. The city has 3 layers and we'll be starting right at the top. But I'm going to first take us through the intended way. Did you get that? Yeah, no other city so far has received quite the introduction that the Court of Fontaine has. Mondstadt got a few setting shots, Liyue didn't get anything as far as I'm aware. Neither did Inazuma City. Sumeria did get a cutscene when arriving at the city that set out the connection between the Akasha and Academia, and Natlan got a shot of the entrance. However, the other cities aren't as integral to the environmental storytelling as Fontaine City is, or at least not in the same way. Hoyoverse love to have the way the player is meant to first initially see the region moments. For Fontaine, the first one was from the desert as you get to look out and wave at the landmass sitting atop these incredibly massive waterfalls, and the second impression is this one. So let's just go through this real quick. We start off on an aquabus ride heading for the court, so it's already been established that this is the main form of transport in and out of the city. Next we get a shot of what is down below. Stay with me here, okay, because it is all about layering in Fontaine, and this shot shows us 2 things. One, the rubble of what remains of parts of the city that have been lost to the water, and we're above it because we're meant to ignore it. Next up, we come level with the aquabus route, and then the most spectacular shot as we start from one side of the tunnel, head through it and out, we arrive at this grandiose entrance as the camera pans above and over the characters to show this. We've got the pipes at the front that circle around the elevator, and the Palais to tell us exactly where we should be looking. The upper level of the Court of Fontaine is peak environmental design, especially coming in from Maritime Harbour. It makes use of the foreground, the pipes, the background, the Palais, and the middle, the focal point, which is the elevator. There is no denying here that the layering is a visual treat. A bit further along, we also get a shot that's even higher. A bird's eye view of everyone arriving at the city. We're a spectator, simply looking at a simulacrum, if you will, that's not representative of the people's actual lives. And also, I just now noticed, don't the splitting aquabus lines sort of look like a trident? So, did you notice how the shots kept getting higher? This cutscene immediately sets up what Fontaine and the city is all about. It's almost like the Hydro Archon is based on Focalor, the demon from the Arsquisha who wants to return to heaven but can't, and that's why they keep building higher and advancing more, making airships that go into the sky. That's why there's layers. Everywhere I go, there's layers. It's all I see. Anyway, back to the upper level. The place where justice is upheld. Much like its inspiration, the Palais Bourbon, the Palais Mammonia is the focal point of the Court of Fontaine. It looms over the rest of the city, looking down upon the people below. And this is where we can start seeing the conflicting ideals. A building that is meant to symbolize protection and justice, at the same time for many, represents authority and power, but not in a good way. It's a barrier. We see the huge physical separation between those with power and those without, even needing to climb extra steps just to reach the building. Note also how this layer is not surrounded by walls. As we go on, you'll see even more of this. Another thing of note about the Palais is how the outside does not really match the interior. Take this tall tower for instance. If you go inside, you don't see it when you look up. And then there's these buildings that are just completely inaccessible but still look like they're being used. This building that exits out onto the aqueducts just underneath, and a different aquabus route. A route that I genuinely cannot explain. Okay, first off, even if it's not being used anymore since half of it is collapsed, there's got to be an entrance to this building somewhere. You've got these massive doors all over over the city. There's an elevator here that would have been used to access this part of the city, but it's just so weirdly placed and again, not easily accessed. Like, why does the platform take up most of the aqueduct? The water also just stops here, though maybe it drains out underneath. And you also still have this unnamed line. What I think is also interesting is that access to the Institute is through the upper area of the court too, and completely disconnected from other aquabus lines. Whether this was intentional or not, it does add to a piece of storytelling that perhaps education is inaccessible for many in Fontaine as well. The city's structure and layout invites us as the player to think about this dichotomy as we head further down. So the next portion is full of all these spaghetti-like structures interweaving between one another, the pipes curving from one building to another, this fountain that I'm not really sure who it's even for, you can barely see it, the entire aquabus platform, the aqueduct that circles all around the perimeter of the city, and this intricately detailed garden at the entrance of the city, surrounded by water that just kind of exists on its own, and with no clue how anyone would even access this garden. Then finally, as we take the elevator, which, might I add, moves in real time, we arrive at the ground floor. The central elevator is integral to the functionality of the city. One single elevator for everyone that lives here to get in and out of the city. What? I'm sure I don't need to explain just how hazardous this would be. Where's the fire exit? I mean, you have the disappointingly empty trade entrance, but that doesn't actually exist. It leads nowhere, which honestly, I definitely think this could be better. They go through the effort to show off these other two harbors, but then all the trade ends up at this tiny artificial building that doesn't actually give the impression this is where all the trade and commerce happens for the entire city. With how Fontaine City is designed, it provides a contrast to the rest of the region that's profoundly empty. We've talked about how the lack of a trade port breaks the sense of a lived-in space, but Fontaine City does at the very least have places like markets and restaurants, so they do have food. It's just we don't know how they get it in and out of the city. And again, that's not mentioning that for one thing, there's no other way to access the city other than two aquabus routes, no connection to ground level, and not only that, Fontaine doesn't even have farms anyway. There isn't much civilization outside of its walls in general, so if there is any kind of agricultural industry in the region, there's certainly no evidence of this. Where does all the food come from? How does any trade happen? Constructing the aqueducts high up is a smart move, only the thing is, with the incredible amount of traffic that would be coming in and out of the city, it's not sustainable, especially when you consider 1, they were built mainly for tourism anyway, and 2, you can only fit one boat in here. But we're getting off track again. The elevator. For the player, to use it would be a very active choice, because, well, I'll tell you, when I first arrived in Fontaine City, I certainly didn't use it. I just jumped down. And I think there is the question of, while the elevator moving in real time is impressive, would it be more convenient for the player if it was just immediate? But like I said, you could just jump down or simply teleport, so really, the elevator is probably just there purely for world building. It's just, unlike the aquabus, there isn't really all that much to see if you use it. Also, the hands on this clock actually move. So, you exit the aquabus station out onto the main square, which is another great use of perspective and layering in the environment. The big energy ball thing is the centerpiece since that's their power source, and the walls in the background encircling the monument, as well as the Fontaine banners that actually do have a bit of movement to them to bring the place to life more. And that's when you look up and see the structures that hang above the everyday people of Fontaine. It's rather suffocating. The sightlines feel more closed off to give that sense of scale. The verticality allows for the city to feel bigger than it actually is, but it also feels almost like it could swallow you up. You can definitely feel how people living here feel, which I would imagine is the intention from Hoyoverse, and it communicates multiple meanings. 1, the architecture conveys the looming threat of the floods closing in on the people, the buildings surrounding you just as the water would, and 2, the social hierarchy of Fontaine, buildings squished together and confined beneath the ever-present eyes of those above. The people below are quite literally left in darkness. It's a good use of lighting in this regard. Combine all of this with the cold colour scheme and mechanical nature of the city, and it's rather oppressive. I think when it comes to general city design, this article sums it up perfectly. In an interview with senior environment artist for Blizzard, they explain, "I believe the work of an environment artist is to temporarily transport the viewer to another reality. A well-constructed environment has the power to transmit very subtle things, such as emotions, feelings, and sensations. That immersion can be accomplished by the artist, expertly using a combination of techniques that are not very obvious to the untrained eye. Because in games, we are usually constructing fictitious worlds, we have total freedom to design our spaces in a way that amplifies the needs of the narrative. We can shift things around, design impossible buildings and materials, and composite the scenes in a way that doesn't necessarily makes sense, but that conveys what we want to express. This is a fine line to walk. If you make spaces that look too crazy, the spell will be broken. What Hoyoverse have done with the court of Fontaine is incredible. They focused heavily on essentially making the city its own character, but we can definitely see this fine line also being walked with the city as we delve deeper. We talked about how the infrastructure and environment serves to create this oppressive atmosphere. However, let's take a look at why it could be confusing from a player's perspective. Even though this whole middle section of the city is just one big circle, it's still somehow rather confusing to navigate. You've got the smaller paths that weave in and out of the larger ones, and even in this middle layer, you've got layers upon layers, different levels above and below one another. Look how many levels there are here. 1, 2, 3, and stairs. Lots of stairs. They may have an elevator, but accessibility is definitely a huge issue in Fontaine, as it is in all the major cities. To be fair to Fontaine though, it could be even worse. But B, I hear you ask, aren't real cities basically just big mazes that you get lost in? And to that I answer, well, yes. But for a video game, you do need to take into account player experience. That's exactly why it's such a fine line. And you can just as much argue that this is all intentional. You end up feeling as lost as the people of Fontaine probably do. There's also the matter of the map as well. I feel like it's not particularly good when I still can't tell what I'm looking at or orient myself even after looking at the map. I think vertically layered cities could benefit more from the underground map layering, because we can see here they have separated the sewer hub, but this, I don't know what's under there. You've got technically 5 layers in the Court of Fontaine, and they're all covered up by various floors and overhanging structures. Something else to consider from the player's perspective is that of the hub or safe space, which is generally the rule that video game cities follow. And when it comes to Genshin, we players gravitate toward Catherine and the alchemy table. The main issue with this hub is that you have to travel halfway across the city to access a cooking pot, and also just that it never felt particularly welcoming compared to other cities. I actually love what they did with Sumeru City's waypoint. Love it or hate it, they really cooked with the TP for this one. And it's similar with Inazuma too. Providing a beautiful environment to look at is important for regular spots the players would be stopping at. Only problem with Inazuma though is this stupid cooking pot. So there is a lot of attention placed on the details of the streets. We get to see more of that inspiration from Haussmann's renovation of Paris as we walk along. Kiosks, benches, these little shelters, the police boxes. Very French. But something noticeable about the public spaces is every park and rest area is shrouded in perpetual shade. Even places you're meant to relax in end up feeling uninviting. The buildings up higher have a bit more access to light. High-end businesses such as Hotel de Bord and the Steambird, as well as a few houses along the top, and then market stalls and most people's living spaces are along the bottom. Now, it would be remiss of me to move on without mentioning the windows of the houses. It's to give the illusion that these buildings are inhabited even if we can't directly access them. But if you look closer, the interiors consist of these rather unnerving empty spaces that contain just 1 or 2 pieces of furniture. Probably because if you're just looking straight on and see a bookcase filling that entire wall, then it seems like an actual room. But look to the other side and see, blank walls, no doors or anything. The rooms are meant for us, the players, not the people that live there. It's a bit too obvious. You look through any one of these windows and then back out to the rest of the city, and it's almost jarring in a way. Take a look at these bay windows. Depending on which window you look through, the room is different. This side it's got just a bookshelf, then that changes into a bed, and then it transforms into an empty room and a door that is physically impossible. Also, this one building in particular really bugs me. Are you telling me whoever wants to get in there has to first enter the building through this door and then climb up and around to access this section that seems way too small to be able to have any room inside in the first place? It's also the same problem with doors, because there are so many buildings that, sure, you can't access. Most buildings are inaccessible anyway, but a lot of them don't even have doors to insinuate they're being used. This is exactly the thing with Fontaine though specifically, because the very design of the city is artificial. It's meant to put on a show, a certain narrative that they want everyone to see, and because it is just in essence a city within a game, there's even more layers to it, since we as the player are aware it's a video game city, but the developers try their best to make it at least feel like it could be real. But it's Fontaine, so it's all essentially artificial. And this, folks, is our segue into the final section of the video, the sewer system. The underground is a stark contrast to the city above. Damp, dingy, extremely unsafe might I add. The tight spaces feel even more suffocating confusing than above, the extra layers showing us how the people living here have had to make the most of the limited space. We're reminded of the region of justice and those it has failed and rendered invisible. As for the sewer system itself, we can only do our best guesswork as we only get access to a very small portion of the overall sewers, though they do have manholes, which is a nice touch. We know that Fontaine uses steam power. It has a vast underground sewer system, and it's most likely growing for its industrial revolution. We don't know where or if the sewer empties out. There's no evidence of this on the outside walls, or if it simply is deposited somewhere. I'm also pretty sure that having all this stuff strewn along the channel is gonna cause a lot of blockage. Not to mention that dragon guy, every time he cries, he's gonna cause another flood himself. You know, the existence of a sewer system indicates that Fontaine does have toilets, even if we don't see them. But then what does that mean for other cities? Where do the people of Teyvat go to flush their duk-duks? This is one question I don't think we'll ever get an answer to, unfortunately. But okay, we're not gonna get much information on the sewer system. How about these structures? Do any of these pipe things serve a purpose? Now at first, I thought these ones could be pipes that carry water, but the more I look, the likelihood is that they're probably passages for people. They all connect back up to the central elevator from different sections of the aquabus lines, and that would also explain how people access these platforms. And yes, I am basing that theory on this one lady standing here. So what is this one pipe doing? It might simply be for show, and I would honestly say that's the likely purpose. The only other explanation is the possibility of it transporting water via steam power from one side of the city to the other. But then if that's the case, and these structures aren't for transporting water, how do they transport the water for the aquabus lines? It has to come from somewhere, and there needs to be somewhere for it to be released. So it has to be through these doors. Perhaps they keep the water supply in these tall buildings and have a lock system that releases it, but that still doesn't explain how they prevent overflow. So this is a city that has had to keep rebuilding after floods, but the only part of the environment that really communicates this is the destroyed outskirts and walls. While we're on this topic, even though some of the city's design may be confusing, there's still so much detail and thought that has gone into it with regards to its history. This side, for instance, ignoring the obvious issue of how the elevator is even accessed, what's cool about it is that you can see there used to be more to the city here. Look how big it would have been. And if you've done the quest with this guy, you can even go underwater and see all the caved in parts. Entire streets and buildings lost to the sea. We can even do a rough outline after looking at the underground map to see what the city would have looked like. As much as Fontaine is all about following rules and laws to the T, you're left with the impression that they didn't exactly plan ahead when building the aquabus lines, or these needlessly extravagant pipes and platforms. For all they knew, they could have experienced more floods, and subsequently would have then had to attempt to build around these unnecessary structures. The Court of Fontaine is meant to serve a purpose in the storytelling. The layers upon layers of beautiful yet oppressive architecture reflect the themes of the region, so much so that the city basically becomes its own character. I think for all the confusing design aspects that are incorporated into the city, the Court of Fontaine still manages to get a lot of things right, and its architectural design and environment certainly leaves a lasting impression. What do you think the Court of Fontaine does right as a city, and what do you think it does wrong?